You, I, we. Believe that beasts, or animals, are incapable of passion. Yes. During the expedition into Upper Egypt under General Desai, as a young fellow soldiering in my first campaign, I was immediately captured by a tribe of wild Arabs, taken by them deep into the sands of the desert beyond the cataracts of the Nile, in order to place sufficient distance between themselves and the French army. These Bedou made a forced march, only halting when night was upon them, and then not surmising that the notion of flight would occur to their prisoner, myself. Surrounded as I was on all sides by the vast empty spaces of northern Africa, they contented themselves with binding my hands. They made their nomadic tea, and eventually they fell asleep. When I saw that my enemy was no longer watching me, I made use of my teeth to steal a scimitar. I fixed the blade between my knees. I cut the cords which bound my hands. I seized a rifle, a dagger, a sack of dried dates, oats, powder, and shot, leapt onto a horse, and spurred off vigorously in the direction where I thought to find the French army. Indeed, so impatient was I to see a bivouac again that I pressed on the already tired courser at such speed that at last the poor animal died, leaving me alone in the desert. After walking some time in the sand, I came upon a cave cut into the side of a small hill, on the summit of which a few date palms laden with fruit shot up into the air, and I could hear a spring bubbling nearby. But despite the reassurance of this unlooked-for manna, a black despair gripped me. The melancholy sands, glittering like a blade of steel, spread out as far as the eye can see. The sky was oriental blaze, brilliancy that brings nothing but despair, leaving the imagination nothing to desire. The silence of the desert is awful. Its wild and terrible majesty, infinity, eternity, immensity presses in upon one's soul from every side, and in my solitude and in my fatigue I lost my nerve. I threw my arms around the trunk of one of the palm trees as if it was the body of a friend, and I wept. Last I lay down in the cave upon a rock of granite, capriciously cut out like a camp bed, and eventually fell asleep without taking any precautions to defend myself. I was 22 years old. In the middle of the night, my sleep was troubled by an extraordinary noise. The deep silence around me allowed me to distinguish the alternate accents of a respiration whose savage energy could not come from a human creature. Through the shadows I perceived two faint yellow lights, and the vivid brilliance of a starlit night aided me gradually to distinguish a huge animal lying but 2 steps from me, across the entrance to the cave. The reflection of the moon descending on the horizon lit up the den, rendering visible and resplendent the spotted skin of a leopard. The Lion of Egypt slept, a face toward me, her muzzle smeared with blood. She's had a good dinner, I thought. She won't be hungry when she wakes up. I thought to shoot her. Too close, the gun was not loaded. Stab her with my dagger, but not sure of a single blow doing the job. I resolved to wait and to watch. The fur on her belly and flanks was of a glistening white. Small marks like velvet formed beautiful bracelets around her feet. Her tail, also white, ended in black rings, and the over part of her dress, yellow like unburnished gold, had the characteristic blotches in the form of rosettes, which distinguished the leopard from every other feline species. The tranquil and formidable hostess snored in an attitude as graceful as that of a cat lying on a cushion, her blood-stained paws, nervous and well-armed, thrust out before her face. A face of a strange, hypnotizing Asiatic beauty, which rested upon them, and from which radiated her straight, slender whiskers like threads of silver. For a moment, my courage began to fail before this danger, though no doubt it would have risen in the mouth of a cannon charged with a shell. But then a bold thought brought daylight to my soul, and like men driven to bay who defy death and offer their body to the smiter, so I, seeing in this merely some tragic episode, resolved to play my part with honor until the last and bravely await the awakening of my enemy. I was 22 years old. The sun appeared, the leopard opened her eyes, put out her paws with energy, yawned, showing the terrifying apparatus of her teeth, turned toward me and looked at me. The rigidity of her metallic gaze made me shudder. She stood up, she walked toward me, and then she stopped. Sniffed the air between us. And she came on again. I let her come quite close. And then with a movement, both gentle and amorous, I passed my hand over her body from her head to her tail, scratching the flexible vertebrae which divided the leopard's yellow back. Her eyes grew gentle. And when for the third time I had accomplished this interesting flattery, she gave forth one of those purrings by which cats express their pleasure, though this murmur issued from a throat so powerful and so deep that it resounded through the cave like the last vibrations of an organ in the church. She rubbed herself against my legs, putting up her back after the manner of all the race of cats, and then she gave vent to that wild cry which naturalists compare to the grating of a saw. I was bold enough to play with her ears, caress her belly, rub her head as hard as I could. I tickled her skull with the point of my dagger, watching for the right moment to stab her, when it occurred to me that in order to kill this savage princess with a single blow, I must poignard her in the throat. So I raised my blade to take my aim, and the leopard, satisfied, no doubt, laid herself gracefully at my feet and cast up at me a glance in which there was mingled a kind of goodwill. Put up my blade, ate my dates, leaning against one of the palm trees, casting my eyes alternately on the desert in quest of some liberator and upon my terrible companion to watch her uncertain clemency. When I finished my breakfast, I tried if I might walk up and down, and she left me free, contenting herself with watching me with her eyes. So I walked onto the spring, and where I found the remains of my horse. Yes, the leopard had dragged the carcass all that way. About 2/3 of it had been devoured. The sight suggested me to the idea of trying to stay on good terms with the leopard during the entire day. I returned to her, and she played like a dog with its master. She allowed herself to be rolled over, knocked about, caressed alternately, sometimes provoking me, putting up her paws in a soliciting gesture. And she let me do whatever I liked. When I began to stroke the fine hairs on her feet, she drew her claws in carefully. Carefully. I thought my first sweetheart, who I'd nicknamed Mignon. By way of contrast, she was so atrociously jealous that during all the time of our love, I lived in fear of the night. But this memory suggested the idea of getting me the leopard to answer to this name. Toward the end of the day, she got in the habit of looking up whenever I cried Mignon. As night fell, she gave several times running a profound, melancholy cry. Ooh, she's been well brought up, I thought. Come, ma petite blonde, I'll let you go to bed first, counting on the activity of my legs to run away directly she was asleep and seek another shelter for the night. I awaited the hour of my flight, and when it arrived, I walked vigorously in the direction of the Nile. I made about a quarter of a league when I heard her bounding after me, crying with that saw-like cry. And then suddenly I fell into one of those movable quicksands from which it is impossible to save oneself, and the leopards seizing me with her teeth by the collar, springing backwards, drew me as if by magic out of the whirling sands. Oh, my dear Mignon, we are bound together through everything now. Life, death. No jokes, mind. The desert seemed inhabited. It contained a being to whom I could speak, and whose ferocity was rendered gentle by me. Secure in this godlike confidence, I slept. When I woke, she was nowhere to be found, so climbing the hill, I saw her in the distance, bounding toward me. She arrived, jaws dripping with blood. Oh, my dear Mignon, you've been eating some poor Arab or other, have you? Well, don't you take to eating Frenchmen, or I shan't like you any longer. So, we continued in this blissful manner for some weeks. Leopard feeding elsewhere, and I subsisting on dates and whatever small game I could take with my gun from around the spring. The companionship permitted me to appreciate the sublime beauty of the desert and the solitude. Solitude revealed to me all her secrets. I saw in the rising and the setting of the sun sights unknown in my world. I studied the effects of the moon on the ocean of sand, while the wind made waves swift of movement and rapid in their change. I lived the life of the Eastern day. I marveled at its wonderful pomp, and having spent the day reveling at the sight of a hurricane over the plain, where the whirling sands made red, dry mists poisonous to all who breathe, I would welcome with joy the coming of the night, for then fell the healthful freshness of the stars, and I listened to the imaginary music of the skies. Solitude taught me to unroll the treasure of dreams. And I spent whole hours remembering nothing. I grew passionately fond of the leopard. The inflection of her voice, the expression of her eye, the line of her body, the pose of her head. She seemed expressive of every human feeling I could imagine. Totally attentive to me, but with no notion of me, no doubt, as she chased down her prey or drank from the spring. Utterly present in the moment with no notion of mortality. And as my memory of mankind faded, it seemed more and more trivial. The great expanse of space and time oppressed me no longer. The great emptiness opened my life. Whether it was my will that modified the behavior of my companion, or whether because she found abundant food elsewhere she respected my life, I don't know, but I do know that I lost the taste of fear in this most dangerous predicament. I feared no longer. Why? Why? I don't care. It happened. One day in a bright midday sun, a huge bird coursed through the air and landed, and I left my companion to go and look at our new guest. After a moment, the deserted sultana growled deeply. Oh my goodness, she's jealous. The eagle disappeared into the air. She stood up and ran at me, as if enraged. And then she stopped, and sniffed the air between us, just as at our first meeting. Her eyes flashed like lightning, and then she shut them tightly, and I said, my God, she's got a soul. And I looked at her, this queen of the sands, white like them, yellow like them, solitary and burning like them. the day came. I don't know if I hurt her, but she rolled off in anger and with her sharp teeth caught hold of my leg. Gently, no doubt, but I think she would devour me, plunged my knife into her throat. She rolled over with a cry that froze my blood. And I watched her die, still looking at me without anger. Since that day, I've been in war. Spain, Germany, France, Russia. But in all that time, I've never seen anything like the desert. Yeah. It's very beautiful. I'm not always regretting my leopard and my palm trees. But the desert, you see, is God without mankind.